红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎，他领导我们的解放哎，真理翻身当家做主人，咿呀咿自由呀呀自由啊，真理翻身当家做主人。天上太阳红呀红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎，他领导我们奋勇前进哎，革命江山一呀一根红哎，一呀一自由呀呀自由啊，革命江山一根红。上太阳红呀红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎，他领导我们的解放哎，真理翻身当家做主人，咿呀咿自由呀呀自由啊，真理翻身当家做主人。天上太阳红呀红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎，他领导我们奋勇前进哎，革命江山一呀一根红哎，一呀一自由呀呀自由啊，革命江山一根红。太阳红呀红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎，他领 我们奋勇前进哎，革命江山一片红哎，嗦啦子嗦啦子咿呀，一片红哎。
Okay, I think we've had quite enough of that. So, ni hao ma. Greetings to the oppressed masses of Bohanka Watch as they rail against the Wall Street capitalist gangs. And fraternal and special greetings to a very special visitor to the economic zone, the deracinated island nation of Great Britain. For those who missed the stream earlier on, yes, we were graced. The modern saint of Western liberal democracy himself, Volodymyr Zelensky, his came to London to greet his benefactors and ask the British people to share their wealth and their effort to build a Ukrainian victory against the Russian people. And the evil will lose. And transgenderism, diversity, all the liberal democratic values, our shared common values, will win. This is a victory for us all. So that's what's happened today. Of particular note, a surprise visit. A very welcome surprise visit from everyone's favorite secular saint who can do no wrong. So, but I'm, as always, I'm depressed. The world's going to end. We're all going to die in nuclear fire. But that's me. How are you, chat? How are you today? As I meander to make up for my lack of usual preparation that defines these streams. How is everyone? How is chat? Baroons for all. Use ChatGPT to write you a script. That would require effort on my part. Legit like the chat. Thank you. I'm yellow, don't mellow. Do 99 red balloons. Maybe on the outro song, but that would definitely get me demonetized. If I'm not already. But has Bakhmut fallen yet? Not yet. And probably not for a little while yet. But we will save that for the stream because alongside my incredible lack of preparation, I actually took notes for this. How many lines is there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines of extensive notes that I've made for this stream. It's been a while since I've streamed chat. Why? But we will get into it. So we have 4 really... no, not 4. 3 kind of topics I'm looking to cover tonight. One is my favorite topic, is the balloon. Everyone's favorite balloon of friendship, of prosperous greetings and harmonious intent. But I think I want to leave that to the end. Then I'm going to talk about Bakhmut, of course. Part of that will then spin off. I'm looking to briefly touch on domestic issues in Ukraine and concerning factionalism and the breakdown of the, well, I don't know if breakdown might be the right word, but the end of the cozy consensus political narrative that Ukraine has operated, had the luxury of up until very recently. And then finally, I want to touch briefly on the impending offensive that everyone is expecting but has yet to emerge. So that's what we're going to be touching tonight. I'm going to save the balloon for the last. It's more of a light-hearted topic. And I've only got a little bit to say on that. So, what does chat want? Do they want Bakhmut or do they want... In fact, no, no, it's kind of logical just to go straight into Bakhmut, isn't it? So, Oh, I forgot to ask. Was the audio okay? Is my audio okay? No one's complaining, so I think we are getting to the stage where my streams are not going to be of such poor quality where I have to harangue chat to confirm my audio is okay. So, unless there's an outstanding issue, I'm going to take it that the audio was okay on both sides, on both fronts, on both the song and from my mic. So if that is so, then I think that's one pressing concern that has finally been squared away on my end. So, is Douglas McGregor, sorry, correct about Russia winning? Nuance, lots of nuance. I'm always hesitant to really answer questions about who is winning or not, because just there's a lot of nuance, and I don't think this war can be, at this stage anyway, condensed down to X is winning and Y is losing. I'm especially saving my assessment until the spring offensives from both sides. I think by midsummer we will probably get an idea of who holds the initiative going forward, and that should be a more cohesive ground from which to make assessments. I've never watched or listened to anything of what Douglas McGregor said. I'm not overly familiar with the man. I am aware that he is largely considered to be sort of, he's not associated with Gonzalo as far as I'm aware, but he is considered to be like sort of overtly pro-Russian in the sense that he shills for Russia. Don't take my word on that as such. That's just kind of the vibes I've got when people are speaking about him. So I'm a bit hesitant to really take anything offhand that comes from that sort of assessment. So I'm good, still kicking it, just happy I'm aware of the society that is present in Europe. Lucky for some. But so I hope that kind of briefly addresses the Douglas McGregor point there. Muted. I'll ban you if you start doing that to me, chat. Yes, sir, sound fine. Good. You sound Irish. Okay, I think you are going to get banned, William Wallace. For that, you are out of chat. I'm joking, but please don't say that ever again. The West is definitely losing, mate. If anyone loses in this war, I kind of hope that the West does, but I don't think it's quite as simple as that. And oh, Short Farrell for $50 US. Thank you so much. That's greatly appreciated. Thank you. Honestly, 2 live streams in one day. I know I'm really I'm grafting here, chat. I'm putting in the overtime. You're getting a stream with decent audio, 2 streams with decent audio. But you're spoiled with me, chat. Hot commodity here. Get in now while on the ground floor, because we're going straight to the moon on this one. But thank you so much. That is very generous. Greatly appreciated. I really need to get on to YouTube and actually figure out how to actually get my money out of YouTube. Like all the donations I've got so far are just sitting in some Google AdSense account somewhere, which I've not figured out how they access. But nonetheless, thank you so much. So Voodoo says making you an intro. I've heard about your intros and your videos. Not going to say no, but if I end up in a death vendetta with a very thin-skinned man from Stratford, I'll be pointing fingers at you, Voodoo, if you do. But with that out of the way, we're going back to the roots on this one, chat. This is going to be a map stream, partially, anyway. Should really bring up the studio, shouldn't I? Oh no, wait, am I using this right? This is where it all falls down. Oh, it's showing up. Oh no, okay, that's just the latency is a few seconds behind on the YouTube stream. Okay, so first topic I guess we will delve straight into will be what has been happening since my last real proper stream, which was around about the time that Soldar was in the process of falling. And there's been a fair bit of movement, specifically in the Bakhmut sector, since that stream. So we'll do a quick rundown of what has happened then. So last time I streamed, the Wagner group, with some tepid support from the Russian military, had taken this town of Soledar. Since then, over the past 2 weeks or so that's happened, the Wagner group has pushed aggressively to the north. They've completely cut this northern road from Bakhmut up to Seversk, and they are pressing now Ukrainian forces further north and starting to undermine the Ukrainian defensives in this growing pocket, the Seversk pocket, the Bilhorovka pocket, whatever way you want to name it. There's a bit of movement in that direction, which is potentially bodes well for the Russians if they can exploit it into the future. But again, this is mostly Wagner's show at this stage. But crucially, the Wagner group then started to turn south with the idea of cutting the M03 highway here. People can remember the previous stream on Soldar. I think we briefly took a look at Google Earth on this. Whenever we say highway, you should sort of understand that Ukraine, I'd say Soviet legacy. Russia has proper like full-scale freeways. Ukraine has very few of them. In like whenever I say a highway or a freeway, in the Western sense, I'm sure most of us get the idea of like a 3 or 4 lane dual carriageway. It's a very high capacity road. Whenever you say highway in Ukraine, you're looking effectively at a paved road that might be able to fit 2 cars going in different directions. So that is 1 car on each side of the road. And that is what this road is here. And also this road approaching from the southwest here. So whenever I say highway, that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's a large road by Donbass standards. There are highways in the Donbass. Some of the people who might be in the channel will remember my really autistic stream where I individually examined pretty much every road in and out of Donetsk because I have no life. There are some highways here, but they were under construction by the time of the insurgency, the breakaway of the East. Never got finished. So again, most roads are confined to small paved roads at best, or muddy tracks at worst. And from my understanding is this road here, at the best of times in this time of year, it's a frozen mud track. So when the temperature rises or the rains come, this will be mud, and the Ukrainians are not going to get heavy equipment in or out of Bakhmut. And this is the only road really of sorts that they still have a reasonable control over. But I've seen numerous reports over the past couple days, that the Russians have this road under various levels of artillery fire, ranging from pretty heavy artillery from things like the MSTB. You're talking your 122 millimeter artillery. Sometimes you have Grad rocket batteries target this area, but largely it seems to be sort of, I don't want to say low caliber mortars because I don't think they'd really have the range, but it's kind of like long range mortar fire is a constant harassing presence on this road. So the Ukrainian position in Bakhmut is a bit invested. I'm not too sure if that's the correct word or what. But just to wrap up what's happening in the north. So as you can see, this map is reflecting that the Wagner group is reports, especially some trickled out yesterday, but especially today, that Wagner forces have physically crossed this road into this wooded area here. So this road is now cut. It was de facto cut for a few days because the Russians held fire control. Fire control means that they might not physically be on the road, but they can certainly shoot at and potentially destroy anything on the road. They've had the road under fire control for a couple days now, but now they are physically on the road. So this road is out of action. And further to the north, well, not further to the north, but to the east, Wagner troops and seemingly some elements of the Russian official army. There's some discussion that it could be parts of the VDV, some guards infantry units, some motorized infantry units, whatever it might be. It's still up in the air who's operating where with what. But Wagner, with some Russian military support, have started to invest, forgive my pronunciation, in the Krasnohora area. These are like the official northern suburbs of Bakhmut. And there's heavy fighting's been going on here for the past couple of days, but it does appear that Wagner is in the ascendancy at this stage, slowly pushing the Ukrainians further down into Bakhmut itself. Here, in the heart of Bakhmut. This map's not showing it, and I guess it is a bit up for the debate, but some reports it suggested that a large advance by Wagner, largely initiated by the penal conscripts. These are the sort of meat shields that the Wagner group has utilized. The people recruited from Russian prison colonies in exchange for pardons. They, from the reports I read, if they pan out or not, we'll have to wait and see, is that they initiated an offensive into the eastern suburbs of Bakhmut, followed up whenever they achieved a breakthrough by more professional Wagner units. There's some dispute if this has actually happened or not. I'm not too sure which way to swing it. This map isn't reflecting it, but to take the Wagner claims at least, Wagner claimed that they are somewhere along this road around about 6 blocks from the city center. This is the city center here, so that would put them just on the other side of the Bakhmut River here. So if that's true, that's kind of the entire east of Bakhmut has been lost. So that is what's happening there at the moment. And then, but I think the most crucial thing that has been happening is, while most people were focused on Soldar, because it was kind of the precursing breakthrough in the lines, the biggest show I think at the moment is to the south of Bakhmut. If people can remember back a couple of weeks ago, just around about as Soldar was happening, I did put out some reports that Optorny had fallen, followed by Klishchivka. Forgive my pronunciations, as always, I am not a native speaker of either languages of these countries. Optrony is a part of Bakhmut that for the past 6 months has been passing back and forth between Wagner and Ukrainian soldiers. This is the kind of meat of the meat kind of battle. If people have been following the Bakhmut battle in depth, you'll know of things like the gas station, the supermarket, the garbage dump. This is the area of the garbage dump. Hundreds, potentially up to a couple thousand men have given their lives to capture this garbage dump over the past couple weeks. That's in this area, and it looks like now Wagner has finally secured it and consolidated their position and are increasingly pressing the Ukrainians into the southern suburbs of Bakhmut. Then we go a bit further to the west and we come to the town of Klishchivka. If people can remember back to the Soldar stream, I said that this might be particularly important to the Russians and Wagner because just behind Klishchivka, this is a wooded area. I don't think this allows me to bring up a satellite, does it? No, I need to sign up. Okay, without having to go into Google Maps to bring it all up, this is a wooded hill, a bit of elevated ground that whenever Wagner entrenched themselves on this part of the hill, there was parts of this road, the H32, that came under Wagner fire control. And then, so that cut off another road into Bakhmut. And then following on from their successes here, Wagner, and I do believe the elements of the Russian VDV have been deployed to support them in this area. They have been pushing quite aggressively to the west out of this breakthrough that they have achieved here. Where am I looking? Stopochny. This town here, there's been various reports over the past week or so if it's fallen to Wagner or it's not fallen to Wagner. Up in the air at the moment, but it is certainly in the face of the advance. The reason why there's a lot of talk about this, because if they take this village, then this road is completely cut. But looking at this map and from some other reports, is that Wagner troops have, if not made it to the road, they are close enough to the road to destroy anything that tries to come up it and into Bakhmut. So that's the situation as it stands from my understanding at this point, is that a lot of people are saying that there is an imminent encirclement of Bakhmut. I'm a bit skeptical of that. An encirclement is natural because this is a clear pincer movement that's going on, but I don't think that we are going to be seeing it close for at least another week or two. Ukrainian defense in this area is dogged and fanatical. They are giving as good as they get. They are standing there fighting. They are not breaking. There was some reports of some territorial defense forces to the south that were shattered by the Wagner offensive. but by and large, the regular Ukrainian army and the national battalions, I believe there's an element from the Azov battalion that is now operating in this area. They are standing and fighting and giving as good as they get. So I don't think that we're going to see a potential complete collapse of Bakhmut anytime soon. I think we're still, while it's getting a bit more a war of maneuver around Bakhmut, I think that we are still going to be having quite a fierce, bloody fight for the area for the next couple weeks at least. And why is this? Because this is a very disadvantageous position for the Ukrainians. Strategically, if I was the Ukrainians, if I was Hearts of Iron, Michael, running this war like that, this is a losing battle for the Ukrainians at this moment, from what I can see. Unless the Ukrainians have a secret up their sleeves that they're now going to launch a counteroffensive into one of these Wagner thrusts and push it back. If that's not going to happen anytime soon, then this is a bleeding wound for the Ukrainian troops. To a degree, I need to nuance that a bit, because a lot of Russian and pro-Russian commentators will have you believe that... Sorry, just hailstones surprisingly on my window. A lot of Russian and pro-Russian commentators will have you believe that Ukrainian divisions are being fed into here piecemeal and are disappearing every week into the fight. That isn't quite what's happening. There's been very little rotation of units in and out of Bakhmut. The troops that are largely in Bakhmut are the same units and battalions that have been defending for the past couple months. The Ukrainian army isn't feeding thousands of men into this cauldron, this developing cauldron, on a weekly basis just to effectively die or whatever. It is a select group of Ukrainian troops, and this has been Ukrainian strategy in the Donbass for effectively the entire past year. A select number of Ukrainian troops are, you could say, sacrificed, told to hold the line, whatever terminology you want to use. They are holding on for what they can, and I expect it is with the idea to kind of bog down the Russians, to whittle down the Wagner and the Russian initiative, and to buy time for Ukrainian forces elsewhere to build up strength. But I also think that the big thing now, seeing this breakthrough, is that they're trying to buy time for Ukrainian troops on a secondary line of defense to erect new positions to kind of mitigate this breakthrough that the Russians have. Because with these two roads gone, Ukrainian troops here are going to start suffering a bit more attrition if they're not getting readily resupplied with fresh troops to make up losses, if they're not getting resupplied with fresh ammunition. I'm especially thinking of more heavy ammunition. Cans of 5.56 or 7.62 ammunition can effectively be carried in by a man, but things like heavy equipment, your javelins, your anti-tank munitions, maybe even some of your mortar rounds, I wouldn't really think that the Ukrainians would have much heavy artillery here, but certainly some of their tanks and heavy armor, tank shells. That's the kind of stuff that you're going to have to drive in trucks if you want to get them in numbers. With these roads out of action and this road under constant fire, depending on how cold it is and how frozen the ground is along these fields, that supply is going to be very sketchy, put it mildly. So that's going to run down Ukrainian supply of that equipment in this area and potentially degrade their ability to resist Wagner and Russian troops in their offensive operations into Bakhmut. So that's the kind of thing that is happening in the Bakhmut area over the past couple weeks. So strategically, as I've just said that, why don't the Ukrainians abandon this bleeding wound? Why don't they preserve forces, pull them out to this hypothetical second defensive line, save assets? Again, like I say, potentially buying time for other Ukrainian troops elsewhere. But also, I think there is a domestic political concern, a pretty big one. We are rapidly approaching the first anniversary of the war. I think it is... I'm really bad with maths. 16 days. Not 16. 8. I'm really bad with maths. I'm a bit special with maths. It's less than 20 days away. 20 minus, yeah, 16 days. 16 days away from the first anniversary of the war. If Bakhmut has sort of gained this understanding, this sort of prestige in Ukrainian national consciousness as the city that won't fall, the city that has held up and resisted the Russians, it would kind of give a bit, well, when the city falls, that's obviously going to take a bit of a blow, but there's a sort of understanding that if the city can hold out beyond the first anniversary, then that will be a sort of moral victory that the Russians can, the Ukrainians can try and grab from the actual military defeat that is sort of developing in this area. So there's that sort of moral and political domestic thing, consideration around the defense of Bakhmut, which is why I think the Ukrainians are remaining as invested in that area. So the question is in the next 16 days, can the Wagner group and the Russians potentially close this pocket and take the city entirely? Russian military action has not been the most speediest, so I definitely think that's potentially on the cards. But if the Ukrainians do last beyond February 24th, I expect if they're not encircled, that they will then, whatever troops remain, will rapidly try and get out of Bakhmut and abandon the city. So that's one of the reasons why I think the situation here is developing as it is. So just with that, I did... just before I move on down to other places in the front, I'll just have a quick look through chat. So William Wallace for £1.79. Thank you so much. That's very generous. The Russians did an awful job at Vulgar. I'm not too sure how to actually pronounce this town's name, but I'm going to come on to that next, so forgive me if I don't address that just at the moment. I will shortly. Your maps are cool. Sorry about the racist comment. I don't consider it racist, especially by my action, and I'm a professional racist, but this isn't my map. This is just sort of a generic map that leans more pro-Ukrainian, but it's good for the basics of just pointing out where things are and mapping how things are going where it is. Are Ukrainians in Moscow? Not that I am aware of. And Lucas Milsna for $20 or $19.99. Thank you so much. That's so generous. Thank you. Chat's spoiling me tonight. Thank you so much, guys. Meat shields. Oh yeah. Whenever I say meat shields with the Russian using the penal conscripts in the Wagner group, it's kind of the name of what they mean. They are there to soak up bullets. They are there to draw Ukrainian fire, so more professional Wagner units and Russian artillery can target it. And they're also effectively just kind of pushed into the fray to find out where Ukrainian lines are weaker, so the more professional and valuable Ukrainian Wagner forces can try and break through and exploit it. There is a history of this in the Russian and Soviet army of penal units being used in this capacity, and this is an example of it here. Effectively, they are, as grim as it might sound, they are to a degree meat shields. Conscripts by their, well, not conscripts, convicts by their nature, not exactly the most valuable people in society. In many ways, if they're dying by the scores in Ukraine, it's to a degree maybe a social good for Russia in general. Pretty grim way to look at it, but that's the assessment that the Russian government and Wagner have done. So could you link your Telegram? If you look in the description for this video, it should be there, but copy link. I'm posting it in the chat now, but it should be in the video description. The Rediker plan. Afraid I'm not too sure of that off the top of my head. I think we're a losing game. Okay. Oh no, I've skipped a couple things here. Christos1234 for 20 Swiss francs. Thank you so much. That's very generous. Seriously, you guys, you're spoiling me tonight. I graft hard every day, and you reward me handsomely. Thank you so much. Have you seen evidence of chemical or biological weapon use? I guess I will just address that now. That is in the notes to touch on, but I have seen some videos that suggest that. I've seen some videos suggesting such for a number of weeks. I didn't address them at the time because I was skeptical of them. It's quite a big claim to make, but there was a video that came out the past couple of weeks of a couple of Russians who were moving through a canal, and a munition from a drone was dropped on them, and it's pretty grim, the footage, but it's just say the way that the Russian soldiers died did seem to... It was involuntary spasms, and it's not the kind of movement, and, you know, without having seen people die personally with my own eyes, having seen enough footage in this war, whenever people are shot or hit by conventional munitions, they don't tend to die that way. The spasms and the reactions of the Russians who were hit by whatever this munition was that was dropped on them kind of invoked the idea that this might have been a chemical weapon. I'm not too sure the veracity of it. I can't really comment beyond that. I've seen a growing number of Russian channels report on it, but it's the kind of thing that if something did happen, like all the way up to the Russian MOD would start making a big song and dance about it. So I'm a bit reserved on it at the moment. But I am keeping a note out if I see anything else along those lines going forward. So I am aware of these allegations, and I have shared some of it into the Telegram chat. And if I see any more of it, I will be making a habit of doing so. So, So with that, I will now move to the other part of the front. We'll move north before we move to the other big story, which is to the further to the south. So in the Kremenina area, not really that much change, but fighting has picked up in this area. People who have been viewers of the channel for a while will know that there is a fairly hot contact line along this area, and there has been for a couple months now. This is heavy forested area. This is on the Liman to Kremina axis. Ukrainian forces advance. They get hit by Russian thermobaric munitions. The Russians go into a counter-offensive, push them back a couple miles. They get hit by Ukrainian heavy artillery. They withdraw, and it just circles all over again. But there is a growing number of Russian forces in this area, particularly mobiks, mobilized personnel. Not too sure what to make of it at the moment, but there is a growing number of mobilized units building up in the Kremina area. Is that because they are potentially anticipating a coming Ukrainian offensive that has long been rumored in this area? We'll have to wait and see. But the fighting, the ferocity of the fighting has slowly been increasing as the days and weeks have been going on the Kremina axis. There has been some skirmishes further north with an idea that the Russians might attempt to push to Kupiansk. This strategic town crossing I'm not too sure if this is the Severodonetsk River or... Oh, I think this is the Oskol River. I think this is the Oskol River. There's some suggestion that the Russians are potentially building up to make a push for Kupiansk, try and secure the bridges, for maybe another offensive to try and push back and retake parts of Kharkov Oblast, which they lost in last August and September's Ukrainian offensive in this area. So that's kind of my understanding of the situation on the north. But as you can see, this map is picking up a significant amount of Russian artillery, which actually, before we go down to Volhodar, we'll quickly just have a quick conversation about what's happening. So what's this? Russian jets launched 2 missiles at Samnivka village in Chernihiv region. 1 person wounded, 3 under rubble. Okay. The Russians have been picking up artillery activity on the borders with Sumy Oblast. There have been occasional mortar skirmishes back and forth across this border, and occasionally the Ukrainians have fired anti-tank guided missiles at various random things across the border over the past few months, since the Russians withdrew across it back last March. But this is just something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. There's a lot more as this map rec shows down in the Kharkov area, but I find Sumny a bit interesting. I'm just going to keep an eye on this area, because before... Actually, no, I'll save it for whenever I come to discuss it properly. But needless to say is that Russian cross-border artillery fire has been slowly picking up over the past couple weeks, and that's something to pay close attention to. And I'll go into the reason why whenever I come to it in a few minutes. But we'll go down to the next big show. In fact, just before we come there, there's been a lot of videos coming out of Marianka. Where is that? I should know that because I follow this stuff, and I followed this stuff since Steve. Where's Marianka? It's Marianka. Here it is here. There's been a lot of videos coming out of Russian tanks, particularly T-90Ms, operating in the Marianka area. This is a village that people will, if they've been in the channel long enough and are autistic enough to follow this stuff as much as I do. The Russians and Ukrainians have largely been fighting over this since last June. I think it's whenever the Russians pushed into this area. The town is largely bisected and is effectively rubble, but I just find it interesting that the Russians particularly seem to be relying on tanks as independent combat units here. We're on Marianka. This town is effectively in rubble, at least the Ukrainian part of it is. Completely lost my train of thought. What I was saying here. Russians using tanks effectively as independent units. Constant artillery fire. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. What I was saying on Marianka at the moment. Probably inconsequential anyway. We'll push down to the big story of what has been happening, and that is the fight around Volhodar. So, some people in chat, as always, on my Telegram channel, seem to get angry at me whenever I post about what happens at Volhodar, where the Russians, quote unquote, are making decent progress in Bakhmut. Volhodar is a bit of the opposite story. This is where they seem to be slamming their head against a wall that is not budging at all in their favor. And probably more frustratingly is the people engaged in attempting to try and break through in this area are some of Russia's elite. Not quite the VDV, but we're talking the Russian naval infantry. The 155th, I believe, Russian naval infantry brigade is the ones largely picking up this the bulk of the fighting in this area. If people can remember far back enough, the 155th attempted an offensive back on Volhodar back in October, I think it was, and there was some reports that up to 20 to 30% of the entire regiment was wiped out in the attempt. And it looks like they're attempting again. And going by the footage that has been coming out over the past couple weeks, it seems to be potentially the same result again. So we'll have a little discussion as to why the Russians seem so committed to this absolutely tiny settlement in the middle of nowhere. So, first of all, why? Why is Volhodar so important? Well, people can remember back, the Battle for Volhodar is largely a continuation of the Battle of Pavlivka. Pavlivka was a town that I was sort of confused why both sides seem to have become so invested into fighting for. The Russians lost quite a number of men, and so did the Ukrainians in trying to hold this town, but as this map shows, it eventually fell to the Russians, and then the Russians attempted to follow that success to push into Volhodar, and that's an ongoing situation. But why is this area so important? Largely terrain. As you can see, there is this slight river here depending on the weather, this is either a fairly sizable torrent or it is a stream. But the surrounding terrain is largely Eurasian steppe. It's flat territory. Crossing this river is a big problem for the Russians. If the Russians, this is a defensive line. Rivers in general offer fairly decent defensive positions for the defender. So that's what the Russians are attempting to do, to try and find a bridgehead that they can hold on the north side of the river. This feeds into a wider strategic play on the entire Zaporozhye front. If people can remember, back at the start of the month roundabout, I did a stream about hypothetical Russian offensive on the Zaporozhye axis. It did appear that the Russians were doing that, and then it kind of trickled out. The Russians made a concerted effort to take Kyiv, again, forget my pronunciation. That sort of petered out, but the thing is they're trying. It's part of that offensive stream that I did talking about Russian offensive options. It was, and then some other things which I should probably have gone into in a previous stream, but I made some pronouncements about growing Ukrainian capability in terms of equipment and sophistication in terms of what the West was giving them. I focused mostly on tanks, but it meant in general other systems as well going to Ukraine. And the big thing for me at the time was, yes, tanks, but artillery. The GS, what is it? Ground disposable small launched munition. Is that the acronym for it? Forgive. What was the GDF? General Dynamic. No, that's GDLS. Is that it? Is that what I'm thinking of? Sorry, there's so many acronyms going about. It's hard to keep a. Should know this off the top of my head. It's like GDLS or something. It's the recent announcement of American artillery to Ukraine that has up to 90 kilometers. The reason why the Russians are so interested in trying to push north here, get across the rivers and try and push this line north, once that artillery system gets into Ukraine and starts to be used, from these positions that Ukrainians currently hold, they are effectively able to shell as far south as, I believe the range is just north of Berdyansk. All Russian logistics, GLSDM, that's it, thank you very much, Roland. The G, it's like, yeah, small diameter munitions, ground launch, small diameter munitions, I think it is. It's like a rocket-assisted artillery shell. All Russian logistics lines across Zaporozhye come within range of that, and we've seen the kind of havoc that HIMARS has been able to do, especially whenever it's coupled to the latest NATO satellite intelligence, picking out targets for them. So the Russians understanding this, like the Russians are not a static factor in this. They understand this is coming. And I think the battle around Volhodar is part of the Russian attempt to try and negate this, because this is Mariupol, and the roads and potentially some of the surviving rail networks around Mariupol will be well within range if some of these batteries are positioned just north of Volhodar. And if all this logistics supply network through southern Zaporozhye comes under constant bombardment by these systems, it's going to start really playing havoc for the Russian troops and artillery here that are harassing Ukrainian forces on the eastern side of the Dnieper. It will potentially weaken the Russian defensive ring around Melitopol and on the Zaporozhye axis. And this is kind of where a lot of people are expecting the Ukrainians to make their next offensive, is to try and push down through Zaporozhye, break this land bridge, try and push into the rear of Kherson, and then hypothetically from there try and make an attempt on Crimea. So if the Russians can try and push the Ukrainian defensive line further north, that pushes back this potential Ukrainian artillery axis further north off of the Russian logistics network going through Zaporozhye. And part of it in the east is the Russians need to get across this river. And, well, they seem to assume, and it probably is true, that Volhodar is kind of the nexus through which they will achieve that. So that is why the Russians are so invested in this here. Also, taking Volhodar will start to undermine Ukrainian defenses on the southern axis of the Donetsk front. So it will potentially, if the Russians really start to make a breakthrough, take Volhodar and pushing the Ukrainians back. Maybe the Ukrainian defensive line pushing up to Mariinka could start to disintegrate and cause a further withdrawal further back. Therefore, pushing Ukrainian artillery coverage not only of the logistics network, but also push them further back from Donetsk city itself, which is both a moral and a political objective of the Russian military at this stage. So that's kind of the why Volhodar is seeing so much attention at this stage. So just to give you an idea of what is happening here and why it is frustrating the Russians so much, it would be better if I could bring up Google Maps, but I don't particularly want to switch browser. This is open countryside by and large all around Volhodar. Volhodar itself, let me see if there is some pictures that might help illustrate what I am trying to elucidate here. Yeah, I think this might be able to explain what I'm talking about. So this is Volhodar. As you can see, you've got your Soviet-era residential buildings, but beyond that, you have effectively open countryside, farmland, wide open country that is going to be well within range, visual range of any Ukrainian spotters in these buildings. And you can almost be assured that there will be Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile troops in some of these buildings that will be trying to pick off Russian vehicles that try to move across the open country. This is a point that I was planning to make independently, but I guess I'll figure it in here. What's happening here and what I'm about to explain isn't just unique to here. This type of warfare is what is dominating across the entire front, all the way up to Bilhorovka, until you get into the forests of this part of Kharkov and Luhansk Oblast. The type of warfare I'm about to elucidate on is kind of the standard for effectively the entire war. So what am I about to go into? Open country. As I keep trying to explain to people in these streams, this is Eurasian steppe. It is flat country, open territory, largely agricultural land. Anything that goes into the field is going to be spotted, either by a person physically seeing it or by a drone on one side or the other. So how do both sides get around this? I'll go to a historical analogy. If people know their history a bit, whenever the Allies invaded Normandy, there was the War of the Hedgerows, where both sides fought over hedgerows. The hedgerows were so thick in Normandy that it concealed movement and also provided defensive barriers to the Allied campaign after D-Day. A similar sort of thing is happening here, except for the I'm not too sure if you could call them hedgerows. They're like thin strands of forest between various bits of agricultural land. These are kind of like the veins of the war. The fields are open country. They're a death sentence. Vehicle, infantry, anything that goes out into one of these fields is going to be seen by spotters up in the buildings in Volhodar or via drones. And one thing that the Ukrainians have worked to a T, to a professional level in this area, is their artillery. Everything around Volhodar, the Ukrainians have locked in on artillery. They have it all ranged. The second that they see a target, they can get artillery onto it very quick. And that's the big thing that's frustrating the Russians at the moment. The Ukrainians aren't attempting offensive action in this area, so the Russians aren't able to really repay it in kind. Instead, what the Russians seem to be doing is constant artillery bombardment of the town itself, with some thermo barracks from the TOS and Buratino rocket systems, but the fighting is in these hedgerows, and from my understanding, it's this one and this one in particular. So a couple of weeks ago, the Russians' naval infantry and supporting units attempted to take Volhedar direct across the fields, and they paid heavily for it. They eventually gave up that, and they moved to a new tactic to try and bypass Volhedar to push up to this area. These are two man-made hills. This is mine slag. This is refuse from various mines in the area that's piled up in a hill. Provides a bit of high ground. The Russians are seemingly still attempting to bypass Volhedar to push up and take this area. If they were to do this, obviously this invests Volhedar from the north, fatally potentially undermines the Ukrainian positions in this area and could lead to a collapse of the Ukrainian defense. But the Russians have yet to reach this area because they are constrained to fighting meter by meter a day, it seems to be, along these hedgerows here. The hedgerows themselves at some point are as little as 5 meters across. Some go up to about 10 meters. They're very thin strips. And it is within these that all the fighting are going. Russian tanks tend to more on the eastern side, so in fact, screw it, I will bring up a Google Earth just to be better to explain this. If I had the satellite image, it's a bit hard to elucidate it on. Oh, yep, here we go. Reject all. Oh. Okay, so we'll just switch over to Google Earth just for the purposes of this. So Mariupol, Polanovka, further north than that. Here we go. So as you can see, fairly forested at points, somewhere between 5 to 10 meters. And what the Russians are tending to do is they're trying to sneak tanks and stuff up to the eastern side. So out of direct line of sight from anti-tank teams in Volhedar itself. What happens, and this isn't just in this part of the front, this tends to be Russian and Ukrainian tactics elsewhere, is you'll have tanks, BMPs, IFVs will move up one side of the hedgerow and provide direct fire support. So you'll have infantry pushing up through the trees, and then you'll have a tank, IFVs, whatever it will be, push up, hugging the trees itself, firing point blank at anything that might oppose them in the forest, the wooded area itself. And these areas are a warren of Ukrainian trenches and defensive positions all the way up it. It's under constant various levels of Russian artillery fire, but they don't seem to dislodge them. So this is where the Battle of Volhedar is largely confined to. So I'm kind of tempted to bring up my Telegram and show some footage of it. But if people have been following my Telegram and they've seen various bits of footage of Russian tanks being destroyed or knocked out, and it says the Volhedar area, it is usually along these two hedgerows here. This is where they're trying to push up alongside, and this is where they're constantly being frustrated. Ukrainian infantry are holding them back. Ukrainian infantry seem to be quite adept at reporting locations quite accurately to their artillery, so whenever the Russians try and make one of these thrusts with supporting infantry through the trees, it's usually Ukrainian artillery that comes in and frustrates and destroys the Russian offensive. So that's the kind of thing that is happening in the Volhedar sector of the war at the moment. So at this stage, I'm not expecting or can see any significant Russian breakthrough in the Volhedar area. I think it's the Russian naval infantry are just going to have another pretty brutal mauling, it seems, in the same area that they've had for the number of months trying to achieve a breakthrough in this area. So I think Russian efforts will be frustrated continuously down on the southern axis of the front. But I think up in Bakhmut is where the Russians, and it's not even the Russian army really, it's more the Wagner group, is the one that's starting to pull home some decent victories and news for the Russians finally. this is no, I think that's probably getting a bit too off topic, but yeah, so that's the kind of big flares up of the conflict at the moment. Down in Volhedar, not so good news for the Russians. Up in Bakhmut, potentially some very good news for the Russians, but it's coming at a fairly high cost in men. We'll have to wait and see. This obviously the convict element of Wagner is having strips torn out of it, but we'll have to wait and see how the professional Wagner troops are very, very good. Some of the best fighters in the war. Whenever Ukrainians talk about the professional Wagner soldiers, they talk about them in very good regards. So we'll have to wait and see just what the attrition rate on that element of Wagner is in the Bakhmut area. The convict, the penal troops, I think it's largely irrelevant. I think it's a win-win for the Russians. If the penals break through in an area, well, that's good news. If the penals get themselves all killed, well, that's less criminals that Russia has to deal with eventually. So that's kind of the angle I would look at there. So let me have a look at my notes. How would I weave that in? So next, just before we go into a quick discussion about potential offensive, I'll just have a quick scan through chat. Karatakos Ustes, forgive me if I pronounced that horrifically. Hey, for 10 euros, thank you so much. That's very generous. Thoughts on the Duran? Not a big fan. Never really watched their content, and the snippets I seen of them, I wasn't overly impressed. I don't think if you're following the Duran, you're getting a very accurate assessment of this war. I'll leave it at that. I think I've talked about that enough in the Telegram channel about reopening certain drama. Do you think Russia will launch a major offensive on the 24th? I will address that in just a couple minutes. If you don't mind. The war is over for Ukraine. Ukraine is lost. Nuance. What is the song anyway? It is Red's the East. No, it's not the East. It is Red. What is it? Red Sun in the Sky from The East is Red. It is a Maoist Cultural Revolution era song. It's Zelensky. He seems to be yeah. No, I was not swatted. You really think the Western tanks will make a difference, knowing they arrive in small numbers and the majority will be Leopard ones? Yes. Every tank has a utility of its own. It just depends how long it takes for the Ukrainians to get a decent training regime up and sort out logistics, but I think that is well down the line, but it will eventually come, but it is still a way off yet, unless the Ukrainians are going to be putting some half-trained crews into their tanks and squandering their abilities. So could have taken that coal mine and went up north. I think you might be referring to Volhedar there. Do you know they are trying to break the front line or just fix Ukrainian troops from reinforcing anywhere else in Bakhmut? In Volhedar, I don't think so. Kind of like Bakhmut, but on a... Well, actually, no. Volhedar is different from Bakhmut because the Ukrainians are swapping out troops in this area. So this isn't a holding action the Ukrainians are doing. The Ukrainians seem invested to actually hold this location. Last week, there were reports that some of the Ukrainian units that were holding Volhedar had been pulled out, and fresh Ukrainian forces, I believe they pulled some down from the Kremina area, had been rotated in to hold the position. So there is an active rotation of Ukrainian assets in and out of Volhedar. What's happening here doesn't seem like the Russians are trying to tie down assets, or the Ukrainians are like just trying to slow the Russian advance. It seems that the Ukrainians are invested in trying to hold the town, and the Russians are trying to take the town as opposed to trying to tie down assets. As I was saying before, the Russian naval infantry are just shy, if not equal to the VDV, which you're talking fairly elite, well-trained, well-equipped troops. They're not the kind of troops that you'd be throwing in to just tie down Ukrainian assets. Kind of up here. What I think happened over Bakhmut largely was the penal Wagner units were the ones tying down Ukrainian assets in Bakhmut. And then whenever breaks started to appear in the Ukrainian line, that's whenever the professional Wagner troops and apparently elements of the Russian VDV went in because they seen an opportunity. You don't use elite crack troops who know what they're doing just to tie down enemy assets. You use your poor quality troops. You'd use things like mobics, mobilized conscripts, cheap troops who you can sort of throw their lives away cheaply. Because tying down enemy troops kind of entails that you're going to lose more men than you're going to kill. You wouldn't use your elite units for that. And the VDV and Russian naval infantry are not the kind of units that I would, at least I would think that the Russians would squander on such operations there. So I dispute if HIMARS has been used to shell civilians in Donetsk. Largely, it seems to be just conventional artillery. HIMARS, the Ukrainians use them for very specific pinpoint strikes. What the Ukrainians shell Donetsk with is it's largely conventional artillery. And from my understanding, from what the Russian sources and DNR sources are saying, from shell fragments, it's largely MSTBs, which are conventional 122mm artillery batteries. And from my understanding is, actually that's something I haven't really talked about. Confusingly, you have a part of southern Bakhmut called Optony, and then you have a place just north of Donetsk airport called Optony. The DNR militias have also made some gains north of the airport. If people can remember, back since 2015, the northern fringe of the airport runway was where the front line had been. The DNR forces have slowly pushed back Ukrainian troops, not without cost, but they're slowly making ground, pushing north, with the idea that largely from Russian sources that I read is that somewhere in this area is where the Ukrainians kind of place their artillery that they use to shell central Donetsk with. So that's kind of the angle of what the DNR might be doing here, trying to push north and try and push this constant artillery threat to Donetsk city further away from the city and potentially out of range. So everyone thought HIMARS was going to be the game changer. Russia only won territory for... How will this be different? I mean, I wouldn't say HIMARS is a game changer, but I mean, HIMARS, for the numbers of the batteries that have been sent, have had a disproportionate impact to them. I mean, I don't think the Russians would have pulled out of Kherson if HIMARS was not, if the Ukrainians didn't have HIMARS. It was the pinpoint accuracy of HIMARS that put the Antonovsky Bridge out of action. It is the pinpoint accuracy of HIMARS that it was the thing that kept hitting Russian artillery depots and their ammunition stores that caused them to move back like 80 miles, which has put a strain on Russian artillery ever since. Like, everyone's kind of overplays it whenever the West announces various equipment like, oh, Wunderwaffe and all that. No, but they all do have a bit of artillery and they do have a place to play in the war. But in terms of like HIMARS, it has played a disproportionate influence in the war compared to the number of units sent. And then the new artillery system, the GLSDMs, that extends that ability to further range, which is going to cause complications for the Russians. So, for example, I was saying about here in Mariupol and supply lines here, this airport, the old Ukrainian airbase outside of Melitopol, the Russians based their helicopters in this area for operations on the Zaporozhye front. Their Ka-52s and the like. Whenever GDSLMs start to really come to bear, this is going to potentially be in range of batteries that are going to operate up in this area. So that means that the Russian air assets here are going to have to move further back and will be less responsive to events on the front. So it's things like that that are making small bits of differences here and there. I'm not going to say that this is the thing that's going to win the war, because I don't, it's not my place to say, and I don't think it does, but, they do play an influence in the tactical situation here and there in the front. They move from forest to forest. Not so much. It just seems to be like, as I say, you have to think of this. Where am I looking? I'm looking over here. These stretches of wooded area, you just have to think of them like extra wide hedgerows that are actually like strands of forest, and battles tend to be fought up and down them. That's kind of how the war is going in large parts of the front. So Mike's still not explaining how USA kind of keep sending arms they will need in Taiwan conflict. I mean, what is there to explain there? I talk about the war in Ukraine. Whenever a war starts over Taiwan, maybe I'll talk about that. But I mean, like, it's a bit out of my purview, bro. I'll answer the next quick ones, and then I'll move on to my next. Finally delve into the offensive topic. So, is there any scope for the Russians to use high-altitude bombers dropping guided munitions? Was that too risky in terms of Ukrainian anti-air action from the Ukrainians? Anti-air action from the Ukrainians, yeah. Both sides operate, I've said this a couple of times through various streams, both sides operate fairly sophisticated air defense systems. S-300s. On the Russians, your S-400s, S-500s, Pantsirs. On the Ukrainian side, you have legacy systems from the USSR like the S-300, some of them modernized, some form of man-pads, which both sides operate. Then you've got various bits of Western equipment, notably the NASAMS from Norway, and you've got German Patriot, and the Americans are supplying Patriot to Ukraine. These are strategic air defense systems, meaning that they can target high-altitude bombers. The only time that high-altitude bombers have been used in the sort of scenario that you've kind of suggested, and they weren't guided munitions, is I believe Tu-22s, Tupolev 22s, were used to bomb Avastol. Namely, that was because, this entire area, no Ukrainian air defense was within the area to frustrate them, so they could do that kind of conventional bombing. But largely Russian strategic air bombers like that, the Blackjack and the like, what they do is they take off from their bases. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was Mark's Engels Air Force Base. I forget where specifically it is, but there's also another Russian strategic bomber base. They take off from there. Generally, what they do is they tend to fly into Belarus, deploy cruise missiles while in Belarusian airspace and pull back, or they fly into Belgorod, Kursk, Voronezh, and deploy their cruise missiles there and turn back. So that's kind of what Russian strategic bombers are doing. They're being used to launch barrages of cruise missiles into Ukraine. So they're being used in a standoff capacity. I don't think we're going to see like carpet bombing with strategic bombers in this war unless the Russians really step up their suppression of Ukrainian air defenses. Oh, forgive me. If I had several satellites in orbit around the, I'd send the balloon to spy on the enemy. Where am I? Forgive me, I need to. My throat is going on me. Let me go quick drink of water. Oh, forgive me. Pardon me. So, it's sad that our streamer isn't answering questions here in chat. Roland, I'm no offense, Roland, but I'm getting the sense you're just kind of here to cause a bit of drama. China is just saying, think you scare us. Okay, talk about the balloon. Look, I don't particularly want to rehash the Duran situation, but like I say, I just find their narrative on the war to be not reflective of what has largely happened. I can point you to various clickbait titled videos of theirs from like last July saying that the Battle of the Donbass is over and the Russians are going to take Kharkov and all this kind of stuff. I think they kind of allowed their political bias to get in the way of reflecting what is actually happening on the ground. But that's just my take. Okay. Like I say, you guys can sort of have your own personal opinion of it. I was asked for mine and I gave it. You can sort of take it or leave it at that. But with that, just a quick word on the spring offensives. So, Sergei Lavrov came out last week. I believe he was in. He wasn't in Zimbabwe. I think he was in Tanzania or somewhere. He was in some African state, and he kind of was asked about the potential Russian offensive on the anniversary of the war, and he came out with, I can't remember the wording verbatim, but effectively like, we've got a surprise for the world on February 24th, because obviously February 24th last year was the day of the full-scale Russian invasion. That anniversary is rapidly approaching. Who knows? I'm in two minds about it. The Russians might try something on the exact anniversary itself. They might try it a couple of days before, a couple of days after. This is all kind of brinksmanship, making the other one blink. But nonetheless, we are expecting an imminent, fairly substantial Russian offensive operation within about a month, if not before. I think it kind of, the Russians are waiting to see what the weather is going to be like, and see if it's amenable to it. I have no real idea where or how the Russians might do it. The Ukrainian intelligence, for what it's worth, has been putting out feelers saying that the Russians might try an offensive on 2 or 3 axes of advance. To me, the kind of obvious one is Zaporozhye. If you want to know why, you can sort of go watch my previous hypothetical Zaporozhye offensive stream. They could try and punch right through the Donbass, exploit this breakthrough in Bakhmut. Be kind of questionable on how effective that might be, but they could try and take another offensive up in the north into try and reclaim parts of Kharkov, areas like Izium that they lost during last autumn's Ukrainian offensive. But going back to what I was hinting at before, and I'm not saying that they are going to do this, but there has been various reports that there's been a significant buildup of Russian assets along the border areas of Kharkov in Sumy oblasts. One thing potential to consider is that maybe the Russians might try and start a new flank in the war to stretch Ukrainian assets. The Ukrainian army, the Russian army is not the Russian army that went into the offensive last year. It's actually significantly larger. It's kind of gone a bit unreported, but the original mobilization order for 300,000 men that came out last autumn is now expanded up to 500,000 men. And the 6 months, was it 6 months? I think it was 6 or 12 months was the period of mobilized duty. That was quietly kind of did away with, and now all the mobilized personnel are under service by requirement, which means that they are effectively open-ended, is that they are to serve until their service is no longer needed. So Russian mobilization has evolved beyond what it always was going to evolve beyond that. So there's at least 500,000 mobilized troops. That's not including the conscriptniki. These are the young men who reach the age of between 18 and 21 every year who are called up to do their conscript national service for Russia. That's not including them. This goes back to, remember, one of the big key issues of why Russia signed the annexation documents for Zaporozhye and Kherson and the Donbass republics. This, in Russian legal terms, is now considered sovereign Russian land. Russian conscripts are legally able to serve in this area and be deployed here. So the Russians have a significant pool of manpower now that they can sort of play with. Their more sophisticated units and equipment have kind of been whittled down over the past year, but they still have deep reserves of equipment to give these men. And they've been held back for quite a while. If people can remember back to my previous stream on mobilization last year, I know it's quite a while, but in my assessment there, as I gave two scenarios, one, that the Russians push all the mobilized troops into the front line then and there, which I felt would be very stupid and foolish. They did do that in some points, but not in large numbers. The other thing I said is it would be more wise for the Russians to hold these people back for at least 6 months and put them through fairly rigorous and intensive training. And that is the model that the Russians seem to have gone by. It's a bit debatable about just how good the training is and the equipment these people are getting. It seems to be hit or miss depending on the unit. But the bulk of mobilized troops have been held back for training and preparation in Ukraine, in Russia, for the past 6 months. So I don't think these are going to be fairly poorly trained and poorly motivated mobilized troops. I think that they are going to have a fairly decent utility to them when they come to significantly come to the front in significant numbers, is kind of what I'm saying here. So maybe the Russians could anticipate to kind of blindside the Ukrainians, is they could try and reopen a front up in northern Ukraine, maybe around Kharkov again. Ukrainians have mostly built up a fairly defensible perimeter in Belarus for various reasons, which I've touched in the channel and on previous streams. There's a bit of hit and miss on what Ukrainian defenses up in this area are. In Kharkov, they seem to be fairly strong, but up in Sumy, it's a bit hit or miss. From my understanding is various Ukrainian mobilized troops, your sort of territorial defense battalions, this is kind of what they're doing. They go up here to man the border and just kind of keep an eye on things, while they also get some training as well along the side. So kind of like, I'm not too sure, second-rate troops is what seems to be what's guarding this border at the moment. So the Russians might decide to try and take an advantage of that and try and punch through and see if they can try and reopen a new front to try and stretch Ukrainian forces and strip Ukrainian assets out of the Donbass to face this area up here. All talk about a potential Russian renewed push on Kiev from Belarus. That's kind of largely died down, because I think it was pretty obvious that the Belarusians are not going to enter the war, and the Russians are not going to try a new offensive into Belarus. There was some fairly fanciful theories about various Russian offensives, like trying to cut off all the Western Ukraine somehow via Belarus and all kinds of stuff like that. I think most people have kind of realized that was never really a viable option. So that's kind of what we're waiting for. The offensive, when it comes, might take us a bit by surprise in its skill and where it might come. So when it does come, be sure I will be talking about it in the Telegram channel and on stream, because this is kind of the thing that I think is going to be make or break, is this offensive season. If the Russians really can't achieve fairly decent results, maybe even some strategic victories out of this offensive. I'm not going to say, it's kind of curtains for the Russians there, but if the Russians really can't start to achieve any kind of substantial victories at that stage, I'd have to kind of question, well, when can they? Their professional army was largely mauled pretty badly last year. They've now beefed that up with a lot of mobilized troops, but they've lost quite a lot of their more sophisticated weaponry. But with that sort of manpower advantage, if even then that the Russians are kind of struggling to try and make inroads, at what point are the Russians kind of going to turn this around, for a better lack of term? On the flip side, if the Russians do make some significant gains and the Ukrainians are not able to significantly hamper them back, I think that's going to really pass the initiative back to the Russians significantly, and that the Russians at that stage are going to, the Ukrainians at that stage will be put back onto the offensive, and they will probably try to replicate what they did in the Donbass last year, these slow, grueling battles to slow down the Russians and cede the initiative back to them, while in the rear, in Western Ukraine and elsewhere, I think that's where they'll be building up new regiments with Western equipment and training. So the Russian offensive and the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the coming months is the kind of thing that I'm waiting to see before I start to really, get into the X is winning and Y is losing assessment. There was definitely stages last year where the Ukrainians were losing and then the Ukrainians were winning, and stages where the Russians were winning and the Russians were losing the war. The war has kind of been, I don't want to say stagnant or stable, but or even a stalemate, but there hasn't been a lot of big changes over the past couple months, past 6 months or so. So this year's offensive season is the thing that I think is going to be make or break. If the Russians kind of wash out, I think they're going to be looking at trying to just secure what they have now in some kind of negotiated settlement. If the Ukrainians fail to significantly repulse the Russian offensive and the Russians really start taking significant parts of eastern Ukraine, I think that's whenever you might start to see Ukraine starting to come forward and maybe opening the door to potential some kind of negotiated settlement. At that stage, like I say, if the Russians really start to turn things around and get the upper hand, that's whenever the Russians are kind of at their best. They can start to really pile on the pressure to the Ukrainians. Let's say if Zaporozhye is taken or put under siege, and then the Russians decide, okay, Ukraine, come to the table and give us what we want in negotiated settlement. The Ukrainians reject. Well, if the Russians are holding the initiative and the advantage and they start to push up and put Dnipro in a similar situation, the way I'm kind of putting this is the way for a Russian victory in this war, I think, is to hollow out Ukraine east of the Dnieper. That's kind of where I'm viewing if there is a road to a Russian victory. That's the way it's going to come. I don't think it's going to come, because the Russians destroyed the Ukrainian army in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. No. I think at that, Ukraine has to be hollowed out east of the Dnieper for this kind of thing to come about for a Russian victory as such. Which will then bring me into the other issue I wanted to talk about. Aristovich. People might remember Aristovich. He was kind of the lead Ukrainian propagandist, advisor to Zelensky. He came out with a very interesting statement recently. If people can remember, he was sacked quite spectacularly. There was a missile strike in Dnipro, I believe it was, or it might have, yeah, I believe it was Dnipro. There was a missile strike in Dnipro. Ukrainian sources came out and said that a Russian missile hit an apartment complex. The Russians disputed that and said that a Ukrainian anti-air missile deployed at a Russian cruise missile actually hit the complex. Aristovich came out and actually backed up the Russian side. He kind of said, no, I think this was one of our missiles hit the apartment complex. And he got a lot of backlash for that. allegations that he was a Russian shill and all this. He was effectively sacked from Zelensky's team. Since then, Zelensky has sort of become a Ukrainian version of Strelkov. He's kind of gone well off message since he's left the administration. Various black-pilled statements on the viability of Ukrainian resistance in the east and Ukrainian prospects in the war. So, like I say, I think him and Strelkov are kind of made for each other. I hope everyone in chat understands what I'm talking about whenever I refer to Strelkov, so I don't have to rehash that. Aristovich, let me bring up my Telegram so I can read his point verbatim on this. He came out with a very interesting statement. Yes, so Aristovich came out with gave an interview to Ukrainian, I believe it was like a YouTube channel or some kind of social media figure. But then a couple of days later, a former deputy head of NATO made a very similar comment as well. So this isn't his words verbatim. I'm kind of paraphrasing it at this stage, but Aristovich came out with this here. Quote, "The war may not end as Ukrainians expect, and as a result, Ukraine may not return all its territories. And the West is ready to follow such a scenario," said Alexei Aristovich, former advisor to the president's office. And not because the insidious Americans do not give weapons or delay, but because success requires 400,000 perfectly trained soldiers with NATO weapons to grind it all up and liberate the territories. Do we have it? No. Will it be next year? Will not be. Let me just take a quick drink. But the most unpleasant thing is that in the West, they think the same way. And we are totally dependent on them. What should the West do? The scenario of the two Koreas. Create South Korea with guarantees, Aristovich said, adding that with this option, Ukraine can get a lot of bonuses. And then, a couple days after that, like I was saying, James Stavridis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, former NATO commander, came out and said that he said that there was a scenario into which Ukraine could find it in a Korean scenario with the country split in two. So, I find this quite interesting because one, that Aristovich came out with it, and then this former NATO official came out with it as well 2 days later independently, which maybe they're kind of prepping the ground for it. So what they're kind of saying here is that for people who are not overly aware, in 1950s, Korea after the Second World War was split into two countries. You had the communist Soviet aligned North, the Democratic People's Republic. Then you had the more Western aligned South Korea. They fought a war in 1950 to 1953. Both sides couldn't find a definitive edge over each other, so they effectively they're still technically at war. They've never signed a peace agreement. It's kind of a long-running ceasefire. So, and that's been the state of affairs on the Korean Peninsula ever since. You have a sovereign country in the north and a sovereign country in the side that both claim to be the legitimate representatives of the entire Korean people, but they're both technically at war, but they're in permanent ceasefire. So, I'm not too sure. You know, this is kind of where my autism plays a bit here, so forgive me on this, because there's not an independent entity, and it's kind of arguable if there ever was one in the Russian-held territories in Ukraine. Russia isn't establishing, you know, like an Eastern Ukrainian republic. There isn't a Russian-aligned Ukraine that they seem to have on the cards. The basis for such a state would have been the DNR and the LNR, and then maybe Zaporozhye and Kherson and Kharkov. Maybe then they could have made like an anti-Ukrainian nation, a pro-Russian Ukraine. In 2014, had the Russians invaded then yeah, all of Eastern Ukraine and probably Odessa would have broken away into this pro-Russian quasi-Ukrainian state in opposition to this Western-leaning Western Ukrainian state. So you aren't going to have two Ukrainian states here. I don't think that's on the cards. There's no indication from the Russians that that seems to be on the cards. It just seems to be if the Russians take enough territory of an oblast, they're just going to annex it outright into Russia, as opposed to setting up a rival, you know, be it a People's Republic independent of Ukraine, let alone a competing Ukrainian government as such. So it's not quite analogous to Ukrainian situation, but a Korean situation. But nonetheless, what he's kind of getting at is what I think he is getting at is that you're going to have a part of Ukraine that's going to be partitioned, probably along these lines under this scenario. And there won't be open hostilities, but Kiev and the wider Ukrainian people will never really accept this. They will never openly sign a declaration of peace or a treaty to acknowledge the ceding of these territories to Russia. So what you might find yourself in is there will be some kind of armistice, be it signed or just de facto comes into place, and then that kind of solidifies into a frozen conflict, which is something I've kind of brought again before, which I'm waiting to see how the offensives go before I really make an assessment on it. But one scenario the war could end is where both sides just kind of come to a sort of stalemate. The front lines solidify, and you just kind of have like a Donbass war from 2015 up until 2022 February situation, where the front line doesn't really move. Every now and again, there's a skirmish here or there, but it's largely just the occasional artillery duel back and forth. And that's one scenario into which the war could kind of solidify. That is kind of feeding into this hypothetical Korean scenario, into which the rump Ukraine here will effectively become a Western proxy state, which is kind of what it is now, but it still isn't properly for various reasons. Where this, just as the years go by and this sort of quasi ceasefire, uneasy peace just slowly builds up its military and becomes an armed camp like what South Korea is. But the state of plays are as such where there will never openly be another war potentially again, and it just becomes another Soviet frozen conflict like Transnistria, like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This kind of like places in Central Asia, which is a policy that the Russians have used numerous times for various reasons. So that is one scenario that could come about in Ukraine. It's an interesting that Aristovich has come out with it. Like I say, he's becoming the Ukrainian Strelkov. And it's just one thing to consider about potential options going forward. But before I kind of really come down one way or the other, I'm going to wait to see what the offensive season comes out with. But touching on Aristovich, the other thing I was looking to bring on is just to touch a little bit on the politics of what's going on both sides. The Russians and local officials in the newly acceded territories to Russia, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson that they hold, have announced that they will be holding elections in September. Should probably have looked this up before I did this stream. I'm not too sure. What are the elections in September? They're not the presidential, so they the regional or oblast elections. Russian elections 2020. No, it's not 20. It's 2023, isn't it? The regional election, yes. So they're gubernatorial oblast. Yeah. So the Russians are due to the Russian Federation as a whole is due to hold regional and oblast elections across. Well, not across every single federal republic, but because the Russians are kind of. Do the Americans do that? No, I don't think they do. The Russians hold elections for various federal subjects of the Russian Federation to their various parliaments, regional parliaments, on different years. As part of the attempt to legitimize Russian rule in the newly acceded territories, they are going to align their elections with the elections happening elsewhere in Russia. Interested to see how these go. Not because I think they're going to be free and fair. I'll leave that up to you, dear chat, how much credibility you put into Russian democracy and electoral process. But the ones I'm really interested in is the elections in Luhansk and Donetsk. Here in Zaporozhye and Kherson, I can fully picture that United Russia will just come in and sweep up every single vote, like they surprisingly always seem to do, like they did in Crimea. But in the DNR and the LNR, they have fairly established their own little political cultures with their own little political parties and their own local political institutions. I actually think in Luhansk, the Communist Party is the one that's in charge at the moment. Let's have a quick look, a little delve into Donbass politics. So let's have a little look. Not so much Luhansk is the one that I'm really interested in, is Donetsk, because Donetsk is the more, by far the more radical of the republics. But we'll just have a quick look. So People's Council, Peace for Luhansk and Luhansk Economic Union. Luhansk separatism, but so that's Luhansk. We'll have a quick look at the Parliament of Donetsk. The point is, what I'm trying to make is that each republic kind of has their own little political culture, their own parties. So will the Donetsk and Luhansk politics, will they decide to run as their own quasi-actual autonomous from Russian political culture, or will they just, will the governing entities and factions in Luhansk and Donetsk just accede into United Russia, or will they maintain their own sort of independent political culture while as part of the Russian Federation? Luhansk, I can sort of see that happening. Donetsk is the one where I think there might be a bit of a problem, because the DNR has always been by far the more radical of the two republics. It's the one that kind of went through some pretty brutal and bloody factional infighting, political assassinations, and the like. Forgive me, I forget his name off the top of my head, but the actual prime minister, the leader of the DNR republic, the guy before Pushilin, he was actually killed in a political assassination. Politics always seem to be a lot more febrile and radical in the DNR. So if that is assimilatable easily without much have a look. Donetsk Republic. Russian nationalism, anti-Ukrainian social justice, social conservative. Which is the one that's like Soviet nationalist? I could have sworn there was like a Soviet nationalist party that was in here, but must have misread it. But what was the name before the guy before Pushilin? The famous one, preceded by himself. Guy before him. What's the guy's name? Well, either way, one of the heads of the Donetsk Republic was killed in a political assassination. The point of what I'm trying to say is I've made it in a previous stream that that's it, Zakharenchenko. Probably butchered that name, but yes, that's the guy I'm thinking of. Is the one where I think there might actually be surprisingly a bit more drama and problems for the Russians in this would be the DNR. I can perfectly see that the more independent DNR might try and push back if the Russians and Moscow tries to like force United Russia onto it, which is kind of a little thing I'll be keeping an eye out for. What am I looking for here? What am I looking for, chat? I'm having a... yeah, well, that was my little point on DNR politics. It's not. The other point is just going back to Aristovich. Up until effectively last month, there is quite a cozy common consensus in Ukrainian politics. I think a large part of that is because any real opposition to Zelensky and his party is effectively being banned and ostracized in the country, but nonetheless, is that anyone who was still politically viable in Ukraine was understandable that any criticism, any factionalism, any political infighting or intrigue was to be kept out of the public eye at the very least, if it went on at all. Because the country came first, and there's an existential threat, and we can't really engage in political shenanigans. That sort of tacit fatherland union, as such, that kind of grand coalition appears to have broken down this month. Factionalism seems to be coming back into Ukrainian politics, or what remains of Ukrainian politics outside of Zelensky's personal power base and party. There's been announcements of a large corruption purge ongoing in Ukraine that is targeting, seemingly, it has no heights to it outside of Zelensky's party. God, there's so many names going in my head, it's hard to keep what's the boxer, the Kiev mayor's guy's name? Klitschko. One of the faces of Ukrainian resistance in the early days, whenever the Russians were making their push on Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, world famous boxer. What party is he actually even party political? So he's not part of. Was re-elected. Klitschko is okay. So he's not part of Zelensky's party. I've yet to hear many of servant of the people, deputies, or political figures being wrapped up in this. But Klitschko is now being investigated for corruption, as direct from the president's office. Various heads of Ukrainian oblasts, particularly oblasts, from my understanding, Sumy and Kharkov Oblast, border oblasts. The heads of those have been forced to resign, and some of them are under corruption investigations. Elements of the Ministry of Defense are also under investigation for corruption. This I have to wait and see. I'm not an expert on domestic Ukrainian politics. Corruption's always been in Ukraine. I think it was kind of tempered for a bit post. Elements of Ukraine it was tempered in post 2014. I think it was tempered to a degree when the war started, but it's come back in a large way. There's a lot of videos going about of various Western supplied weapons ending up in dubious hands in black markets in Ukraine. So there is a legitimate argument for corruption purges, but even then, there is various videos of Ukrainian officials in very nice cars with a lot of money swanning about in Western Europe, or have millions of euros stashed in their apartment, or are rarely seen doing their actual job, and are Instagramming, their daughters or relatives are Instagramming them out having nice holidays in Malta or in the French Riviera. So there is an argument that there does need to be a crackdown on corruption, as there always needs to be. But also it is apparent that, as far as I can see, that the people being hit by this corruption purge are largely people not in Zelensky's party and part of his personal power base. So, considering that like I've said a couple of times, that the Ukrainian state has effectively banned quite a lot of the opposition, the main opposition party, the former, not the Party of Regions, the Opposition Platform for Life, numerous other parties, because they felt that they were too pro-Russian. and what remains is now being subject to pretty strenuous corruption investigations. I think even I can't believe I'm forgetting all these bloody names. What's the woman who runs the Fatherland Front? The Servant of the People. That's Zelensky's party, opposition platform. What's the Fatherland Party? The Timoshenko, is that it? The woman with the braided hair. I think she's been subjected to another corruption investigation. Why can't you just have a list of all bloody parties tonight? Either way, the corruption seems to be coming down on people outside of Zelensky's personal power base, which might imply that Zelensky's looking to neuter any political opposition going forward. So there does seems to be political factionalism is returning to Ukraine. Some of these people are going to be very pissed off. There's been some allegations that maybe some of them have always maintained a degree of contact with the Russians and have been trying to do backhand deals. So this sort of cozy united Ukrainian front, not saying it is collapsing, but I'm just saying keep an eye on it. This could be a mark of things to come, and maybe there will be a bit more discord domestically in Ukraine, things going forward. So that's the point I was trying to make in a less elegant and precise way. This just popped up. What is this? So breaking news. A minute ago, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, Khyrovska Oblast, Zaporizhzhia Oblast, red alert aerial site. So there are Russian airstrikes currently ongoing across eastern Ukraine. Breaking news, chat. Fresh off the presses to you. Kharkova Oblast, Poltava. Yeah, so another night of Russian air missile strikes across Ukraine, it seems. So, with that, elections in DNR. That is the topics I was looking to cover in this stream. So, if anyone has any questions they want to fire at me, I'm going to have a quick look through the chat. Catch up in chat, and then I'll answer any questions anybody would like to ask. Pro tip, as I'm hear that chat, that's me rubbing my hands here. If you put your question as a sweet super chat with a lot of shackles, I will definitely answer it. Otherwise, I will try and answer it either way. So, where am I looking here? Oh, I didn't talk about the balloon. They shot down the balloon. That's all it needs to be said about the balloon. I think everything I really said about the balloon I kind of covered in the Telegram channel as it was happening. But yeah, what a shit show. I enjoyed it. One of the more fun weeks I've had doing this stuff. Americans seem to really have hated the balloon. The second I posted about it, 40 of them left the chat en masse. I don't know, Americans must have a really bad inferiority complex or something against the Chinese, because anytime I mentioned anything about that balloon, or I posted anything Chinese or half funny about the balloon in chat, 5 Americans left immediately after the post. And they were Americans, because there's an option in Telegram where I can look at people who leave the channel. And I individually looked at each of them. And the vast majority of people who left were Americans. And they were all boomer, MAGA patriot Americans. So, yeah, the Americans really did not seem to like the balloon. And I found that hilarious. But what a shit show. Just, wow. You allow this spy balloon to cross the entire country, and then you shoot it the second it gets out over sea, after it beamed all its information back to China, and then you shoot it down, and then you come out and you say, yeah, it crashed here, 12 miles out to sea, Like, chat, this is America. If the balloon, like, crashes, I don't know, what was it, like Myrtle Beach or something? Yeah. So if the balloon crashes here and America is here, you know, this is, the balloon wreckage is quite close to this. So why did the Pentagon come out and say, we fear that this country away over here, Xiongwa, the People's Republic of China, the Middle Kingdom, Xiongwa, that this country 13,000 kilometers away might get to this location here before the Navy from here might get there. Like, what a shit show. Like, I just, what, wow. It was funny, but Christ, I think the Americans are kind of like the Russians in many ways. Not that they're maybe as corrupt as the Americans, but I do think there's a lot of incompetence in the United States military that it's just, wow. I think the balloon was kind of like a national humiliation for them. And the fact that Biden said he authorized it to be shot down on Wednesday, and they waited till Saturday to shoot it down. I loved the balloon. The balloon was hilarious. But what a shit show for like the Americans, for their military as well. And I know it is a lot more complex than it. My throat is dying on me. Ow. So I know the billions of dollars that went into the F-22 program, into building and maintaining the Raptor, that's jobs in America. That is a significant edge over near peer powers in terms of aerial technology and capabilities. That is, you know, yada yada yada. But nonetheless, it is kind of funny, like the $500 billion that's gone into maintaining the F-22 program over the like 3 decades of it has resulted in its first ever air-to-air kill being a balloon. And then I was looking at the basic economics of this. So the tarpaulin to make the balloon is going to be a few $1,000s at most. Like it's a balloon. I don't think it needs, unless it's like some really specialized material. Okay, maybe you're pushing up to like $100,000 to make the material for the balloon. Then the instruments on the balloon itself. Okay, let's be generous and say like it's what, cameras, maybe some radio interceptors, stuff like that. A few hundred extra $1,000. So let's be generous and say the balloon cost $300,000 to the Chinese state to make. Okay. An average flight hour for the F-22 is something like $50,000 to $85,000 an hour. That is every hour that aircraft is in the air. The cost to maintain it and repair it whenever it lands in terms of parts and maintenance is between $55,000 and $85,000. And there was at least 4 of these aircraft was flying up around the balloon for, I think it was around 3 hours. So let's be generous. $50,000 times 4 times 3. So this is $200,000 and $600,000 in flight maintenance. Forgive me if my maths is like way off. I can't say the R word, can I? I'm a very special person when it comes to maths. On top of that, you had an AWACS for some reason, and you had an air tanker for refueling of the aircraft for some reason, also operating at the same time. I have no idea how much the flight hours for that costs. On top of that, the air-to-air missile fired to take down the balloon cost $600,000. Then you have the naval personnel on the water and on the ground who had to come out and pick up the wreckage. On top of this, you had civil aviation grounded in the area that couldn't take off from the local airports, and also this part of the American East Coast is a major airline route. Like, all flights going down to Florida from Europe, going further down into this is the jet stream. This is where all the flights come down. That was diverted for hours. The point is, what I'm trying to make here is that if the Chinese more than got their money's worth out of this fucking balloon, it's just hilarious. The balloon of good tidings, of harmonious intent. So I'm pro balloon. I missed the balloon. The balloon was quite funny. Bring the balloon back. Apparently these balloons have been spotted all over the world. Of course they have. Like, if I was the Chinese, just seeing the chaos this bloody thing caused, I would release a balloon every week, and I would paint it in the trans flag. Like, they just, like, that's what I'd do if I was China. It's just, wow, what a hilarious shit show. I enjoyed it. It was a fun week for me. So, commiserations to Americans. Americans seem to be petrified of balloons and everything to do with China. Sorry to hear that, but I loved it. It was funny. So, that's a quick spiel about the balloon. So, now let's have a quick look through chat. Best Noodle for $20 US. Thank you so much. Does Russia need to occupy all of Ukraine to remove NATO threat from there? Is this not an existential matter for them anymore? That was the initial plan. The initial plan, from what I could see, is that the Russians were hoping to effectively replace the Zelensky government with a pro-Russian government, lock all of modern Ukraine into a sort of quasi-pro-Russian alliance, because it all goes into very deep geostrategic implications. But this is the North European plain. This is very indefensible territory. Anyone who knows their history will know that armies have marched east and west throughout history and caused a lot of damage to everyone in between. But whereas you come further down south, down towards the sort of Moldova, Romania area, this is where you get to the Carpathian Alps. This is a natural barrier. So, for example, the Mongols, whenever they first came to Europe, although they didn't really push much into Europe, they didn't exactly push into Romania or into Hungary and the Pannonian Plain. They pushed into Poland. It's kind of the limit of their advance, but that's because of the Alps just kind of offset them. The Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, whenever they advanced, and they didn't really push this far up north, but the reason why they kind of established proxy states in Wallachia and Moldova is because they didn't have really the wherewithal to push north of the Carpathian Alps and up into Poland, and then obviously you had the Siege of Vienna and stuff. Needless to say, mountain ranges are very good defensible positions. They're very strategic. So Russian geostrategic thinking, you have to look at the Soviet borders. Soviet borders reflect this perfectly. Why is the borders of modern countries like this? Why does the Belarusian and the Ukrainian border stretch this far out? Because the western edges of this, whenever these borders were established, made no sense. This western part of Belarus and this western part of Ukraine was Polish. Down here it was Hungarian, Slovakian, Romanian. So why did this become part of Ukraine? Well, you have to look at the history of Russia and the Soviet Union in the 20th century. First, you have the Germans in the First World War. The Germans, being the masters of warfare as they were, completely overran the Russians, who could not consolidate their ground in the First World War. And once they were able to break through the Russian defenses in Congress Poland at the time and start to break out into the Russian Empire proper, they effectively overran all of what was then Western Russia. Then you get the Treaty of Bialystok. No, not Bialystok. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and then the Russian Soviet Republic loses all these territories. Obviously, the Russians lose the First World War, then yada yada yada. Second World War, the same happens. The Third Reich just completely breaks through the Soviet Western defenses and just completely overruns the entirety of Ukraine and all that. So, Soviet and Stalinist border policy post World War II was looking to extend Soviet borders west, because, well, if you've got a friendly state in Romania, which they kind of had for a while, even if they didn't, you have the Carpathian Alps that stretch along here, and this map. I'm not too sure if this is still the Carpathian Alps in this part of Romania here, but this mountain range here deflects any potential hostile army that might come out of the Balkans and try and push into Ukraine and into the sovereign Soviet Union there. So with this kind of border here, but also you had the Soviet Warsaw Pact proxy states as well acting as another buffer. This is why all the Soviet armies through the Cold War were deployed in Eastern Germany and in Poland, because they wanted to have this fighting here in the Northern European plain, which is where it favors large armies best. If the Russians ever lost, well, if the war had happened and it didn't go nuclear, but the Soviets lost the initiative, this was their big fear, is they could always picture American armored divisions pushing through Poland and repeating Operation Barbarossa 2.0. So the way the Russians hoped to negate this was to have a heavily fortified border between these mountain ranges to the south and to the Baltic in the north. This is a large area, but it's a smaller area than this border here, from all the way from the modern Russian frontiers of Ukraine up through Belarus up into the Baltics. So the Russian strategy and strategic thinking behind the war is, if in the opening phases, if they could have achieved that very quick strategic victory over Ukraine, just swap out the government for a pro-Russian government, well, the Russian defensive axis, instead of having this jut out in Belarus, pushes all the way from this long, unwieldy border here, up here to a more defensible terrain here. You have the Romanian Alps, which acts as a natural barrier to any potential offensive action. It means that the Russians, if war ever comes with NATO, could fight the war in Ukraine on a much smaller front, on this frontier here, instead of having to deal with it, say, in Belgorod, in Rostov, and on this very indefensible terrain that World War II showed that the Russians and the Soviet Union could never really hope to defend. So that was kind of the idea here. This is also assuming that the Russians had the idea to just kind of push into Moldova and form up the bridge with Pridnestrovia. Obviously, one of the big flaws to this plan is the Baltic states, which juts away out here. But the Baltic states are kind of locked in against Russia because of their membership of NATO. But Russian geopolitics is about pushing their frontiers, their defensive considerations as far west as possible. And that is why Ukraine is of such strategic importance to the Russians. Obviously, that original plan has not worked. The Russians failed to achieve that quite spectacularly. So I expect that the Russians are now trying to bolster as far up to the Dnieper as possible, because if you can't have it this far to the west, the next best thing is the Dnieper. That's the next big defensive, natural geographic defensive position that the Russians can really hope to get. So this is what I think the Russians are largely geostrategically, if they can try and achieve it, are looking for now, is potentially frontiers along part of, if not the entire Dnieper. That, to me, for the Russians, would be a very good second best option for the conflict in Ukraine. That might have to necessitate kind of signing off Pridnestrovia and ambitions in Odessa, but, you know, the future is not for ours to see. But that's kind of the way I see that the Russians were trying to treat any potential existential threat from NATO. I think you'd have to go back and watch some of the very early streams with me, Felix and George, where I kind of really went in depth about why the Russians were so twitchy about all of modern de jure sovereign Ukraine joining NATO, particularly this border here that juts so far out into Russia and presents a very, very existential threat consideration to Moscow. So